So my name's Stephanie Bastek. I am on the board of the DC Tenants Union on the Uptown chapter with Roger Williams, who's going to start us off with our presentation.
Okay, we have their first slide is pressure in buildings, pressure on city council. Pressure in buildings, I'll give you an example, two examples actually. One involves a building that I'm in. They're twin buildings, Tripoli Gardens. We've been on rent strike since May the 1st. We've got 75 people out of 226 units that are in support of our rent strike. Of course, what we're asking for is that the management forego charging people rent for the length of the state of emergency and then 30, 60 days afterwards. In the case, the other example would be a rent strike at the Woodner. And they just had a rally, but I'll let Stephanie talk to you more about that. Those would be examples of pressure being put on buildings or management / landlords. Pressure on the city council, we had a day of action on May 13th on a Wednesday, in which we went to the residences of 4 city council members, Anita Bonds being one of them, Robert White, Councilwoman Brianne Nadeau, and let's see, the 4th one I think was Mendelson.
And Alyssa Silverman too.
Alyssa Silverman, I'm sorry. Thank you. The reason we went to this length is because we're not getting them to move in the direction that we need them to. They've taken a pretty much standoff position besides some of the emergency legislation that they passed early on. And we're aware that they're not very happy with our actions in front of their residences. Now, the next slide, our demands. Cancel rent and mortgage payments for the duration of the state of emergency plus 1 month. So it's 1 month. Impose a 2-year freeze on rent increases while the city recovers. Guarantee a right to counsel in eviction cases. Expand the emergency rental assistance program by 3 times what it is now. And expand eligibility and no more annual limits on how many times people can go back to ERAP. And last but not least, enact into law the Reclaim Rent Control platform in its entirety. Okay, public events plus protests. Now, this gets into the sort of protests that we mounted at these council members' residences on the 13th, in which we chalked on the sidewalks our demands. We did chants. We got a reaction, and we are going to be meeting with a bevy of council members, I believe it's the first week in June. Then there's protests outside of buildings. This past weekend in Ward 4, in conjunction with the People's Caravan, Janice Lewis George's city council candidate for Ward 4. And we had one this afternoon, a protest that I mentioned at 3636 16th Street. That's a Woodner, owned by the Woodner family. It's a good turnout. People need help, and they don't need to be, they don't need smoke being blown at them. But the way we really went organizing is by organizing, and landlords are refusing to come to the table to negotiate with tenants. We saw this before the crisis, and we're seeing it now. Rent strikes force them to the table. Landlords have made it abundantly clear with repeated letters about payment plans and partial payments. They want people to pay as much money as they can up front as possible. You want people to hold out for a better deal. Payment plans don't protect you from eviction down the line, and they don't forgive you for back rent. If we don't cancel rent, it's going to bankrupt tenants and enrich landlords.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, I mean, that's really right. We have seen, not just in Tivoli Gardens, but at the Woodner and at buildings across the city, that people are really suffering. You know, when this all first started, I think, you know, a lot of organizers and people were quite skeptical of what could happen with this pandemic. I saw a lot of calls for, you know, how can we organize in this crisis? You know, what opportunities do you see? And I was just really beat down about it. You know, it's really hard to think about how you can do that stuff when you can't even meet in a group. But, you know, we started doing outreach to our base and to people that we'd made contact with. We worked with the Democratic Socialists of America Stomp Out Slumlords Project, of which I'm a member, to see like all of the hundreds of tenants that had been contacted in the past few years, reached out to them, and then really also used our petition to look at clusters of signers in different buildings to connect tenants. Because the number one lesson of tenant organizing really is that if you're experiencing a problem in your building, odds are you're not the only one, and your neighbors are too. And that's true now for buildings. You know, if your building is having a hard time paying rent, if tenants are having to choose between rent and food, odds are you're not the only one in the building. And that's what we've seen. So we have almost 3,600 signatures on a petition, and we've used that to launch rent strikes in 10 buildings. Another 10 are working up to that. And then we've got another 10 that are organizing in a different capacity. And then we've got leads for 10 more. So we are really organizing our pants off. And the way we've done it in the pandemic is with some creativity and then a lot of flyers. Printed off reams and reams of flyers. Here are two examples. You know, cancel rents and mortgages. We use this when we start in a building for scratch and get people to sign on, build lists, get neighbors to talk to each other. I mean, initially it was really hard to think about how we could organize in this when our toolkit, you know, meeting in person, door knocking was kind of off limits because of the health crisis. So we've been really trying to work lists, and we've really learned through all this that any kind of organization is so precious. So an already existing tenant association can really just leap into action. You know, a block party list could leap into action. It's just a matter of starting with contacts and going from there. And then, you know, buildings have escalated. So Park 7 here is a building I've been organizing in a couple of years in Ward 7. And they started a cancel rent campaign. We reached out to contacts, and, you know, they've written demand letters to the landlord, and he still hasn't responded, but now they've got banner drops and, you know, he's feeling the heat. So, I mean, the question then naturally arises, like, why do a rent strike? Why have collective demands when you could just have individual payment plans? Well, because individual payment plans kind of suck. We've seen that landlords are really desperate for any amount of money, no matter when it comes. And the problem with that is that it's not like tenants who have been out of work for months are going to find $6,000 under a mattress, right? And be able to pay off whatever amount of money they owe for the pandemic. We need to cancel rent because otherwise we're just kicking the eviction can further down the road. So right now, rent strikes are the way we're moving because we have a lot of cover and we've seen it work. We've got a building in negotiation with their landlord right now over just how many months of rent they're going to cancel. And they've also started making repairs for the first time. This is something that was true before the crisis too. Once tenants really started cutting off a landlord's supply to his wallet, they started listening and started making repairs and acting. So it's a quite militant, but tenants are really hungry for it. And we have a lot of cover too because of the eviction moratorium, because court is closed, because payment plans are mandatory and they could be collective if we demanded it. And you know, those underlying conditions issues too can be used to drag out the court process. And there's also problems with the fact that a lot of buildings have conditions issues that are exacerbated by the current pandemic. You know, living in slum conditions with mold in your walls, probably not very good for your lung health and probably makes you susceptible to COVID-19. So management across the city is really refusing to come to the table with any other method than the rent strike. So a collective demand lets us scale up and it lets us win. You know, tenants coming together is not something that landlords are used to seeing. It scares them. And, you know, the more we can scare them, the more we can really pull them to the table, the more pressure we have on the government, because the more people are going to be making that pressure. Landlords, you know, have more political power than tenants. That's why we have a tenants union now, because they've had too much political power for too long. And if they start screaming at the government to cancel rent too, or to set up some kind of payment fund for them because renters aren't paying them, that's more pressure, and that's better. So here's a beautiful little slideshow of all the buildings that are currently on rent strike. Oh, I forgot to update the Park 7 one. They dropped a banner yesterday, meant to put that in there. But, and we had a huge action at the Woodner too. So the central little signs, that's only the beginning. So this is all really exciting to see. Tenants are really coming together. Here on the left, this is Roger's building, Roger in the middle there. So yeah, there are 10 buildings on rent strike. So just to summarize like our building level strategy, we found that hundreds of tenants across the city have been reaching out to us through our hotline, through email, through the petition, through Facebook, through mutual aid groups. So if you're living in a building in DC and you're interested in organizing during this pandemic, or just organizing period, odds are we've made contact with one of your neighbors. And the more people we can get started doing this, the faster it'll go. So feel free to reach out if you want to get in touch and start. So the way we scale up is we basically assign in an organizer to rapidly build up tenant leadership and sort of hash out strategy, connect to the central tenant union hub, which has experience and access to printers and flyers and sort of pre-made forms, banners. And we have organizers who have just started in the pandemic. We have some that have been doing it for years. We have others that maybe got started like in the fall and are rapidly scaling up. So, it's never too late to start organizing. So once we have that set up, we start doing outreach, social networks. We do these flyers. We have this cancel rent petition that people sign in, put their information, and then boom, we can connect people, tenant association lists, and then just like a lot of conversations on the phone. I think I've spent more time on the phone during the pandemic than I've ever spent in my life. And it's just a lot of talking to people. So we get these signatures. We then, build up community by having phone or Zoom meetings to strengthen the organization. And then weirdly, what's really, really effective is group WhatsApp chats. So those have really been extraordinary in fostering community and communication between people. And it just becomes a way for tenants to figure out that we're all stronger together. If my AC is out, yours probably is out too. And if we both yell at management, like odds are it's gonna get fixed faster. So this is all pandemic organizing, but we really, really hope that this sticks out, that this continues in the long term, because the more tenant associations, the more tenant organizations we have, the better. And another really important consideration in the pandemic too is we're trying to get full coverage of buildings. We have a lot of different communities living in buildings, a lot, especially in Ward 4 and Ward 1 where Roger and I live. You've got mixes of Spanish, English, Amharic, other African languages, French. So it's really important to identify leaders in all of these communities. We were really lucky at Tivoli in that we tapped into leadership that could speak Spanish and English quite quickly, and a whole collective of restaurant workers that already knew each other. So it got up rapidly. And then as Roger was saying, his building is split into two. So you have to make sure you have coverage in both buildings, or, all 12 if it's a garden style apartment. So once tenants are in community and are clear on what their demands are, then we write up a demand letter and then deliver it by email or post and see what happens. Most landlords write back and they say no thanks, or they say we're happy to offer individual payment plans. And that just isn't good enough for the tenants that we're working with. And so a lot of them have escalated to a rent strike. We've started, as tenants are more comfortable, escalating to protests like today, more public shaming, media, phone zaps. We've done a lot of those. We had one for Richmond Towers today, and we're going to have another one next week for Oak Hill. It's all about sort of figuring out, as in any kind of organizing, what the power relationships are here. So you have to identify your landlord's weak spots and exploit them. So pretty much all landlords that we're targeting can afford to cancel rent, and it's up to us to make them. So how you make them really depends. Some are extremely wealthy and enjoy this sort of philanthropic reputation, like the K. Fritz Foundation, which owns Rogers Building and gives money to pretty much everybody, every organization in the city. They just started an $80 million arts grant during the pandemic. And as the Woodner folks were saying at their protest today, charity starts at home. You should be offering that kind of giving spirit to your own tenants. You can't offer up an $80 million grant on the backs of the people who are giving you that money. It just seems totally unfair. So public shaming might work for them because they have a philanthropic reputation. Other landlords like Donatelli, who owns Park 7, get enormous tax breaks and incentives from the city for building quote unquote affordable housing. Now, a lot of these buildings also have huge conditions issues, and they're getting a lot of money from the government to basically maintain substandard housing. So you can threaten their funding by going to the council or involving the office of the attorney general. It's just a matter of assessing the power relationships and the players in a given building. But that's what the DC Tenant Union is all about. You know, we have a wealth of knowledge through our relationships with other organizations and through just like years of doing this work, so we can figure out, you know, what the situation is for your individual building. So here are just some graphics from phone zaps and testimony we've done. Another strategy that we've done with is, you know, like showing up in force to council calls. Like the OTA had a stakeholders meeting a couple weeks ago with the housing committee. So we stacked the deck with tenant union members who were yelling about cancel rent. We tried to do it for Reopen DC. Of course, they very carefully stage managed that, so no one got to answer any questions or ask any questions. But, you know, we're also submitting testimony and whatnot, both in the coalition for Reclaim Rent Control and then on our own for canceling rent. And here's some of the shaming and corporate research I talked about. This was a flyer we made for the Woodner. They have a whole collection named after them at the Gallery of Art, the National Gallery of Art. One of them owns a dressage barn. These horses each cost about $150,000. These are the actual horses that they own. And yeah, I think it costs about 30 times what someone's annual rent is at the Woodner to just maintain that horse at the Woodner barn.
The Woodner family riding on their $150,000 horses.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, another thing that we're really excited about is working with unions across the DMV. So we're supporting the tenants at Southern Towers in Alexandria. And, oh, sorry, it's Unite Here Local 23, actually, not 25, my bad. At Southern Towers and then also at the Woodner. So that's been really, really helpful because the strategy that we're using, if you're familiar with labor organizing at all, is quite similar to that strategy. Okay. Roger, do you want to take it away for our last hurrah for how people can get in touch with us if they want to get involved?
Unmute myself, and I am unmuted. Join us. Email info@dctenantsunion.org. And the phone number, if you want to dial in, is for English 202-656-3607. In Spanish, it's going to be 202-681-8272. Let me repeat the English one, 202-656-3607. And again in Spanish, 202-681-8272. Now, let me see, we've got another email address, and that's going to be dctenantsunion.org. And I've already given you that. And the Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at DCT Tenants Union. Again, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, it's at DCT or DC Tenant Union. I hope I haven't confused people.
I don't think so. So yeah, feel free to get in touch if you want to get involved in any way, if you want to organize your own building, if you want to get trained up on how to organize elsewhere, if you really want to make some of those sweet banners that we're dropping everywhere, or, you know, if you have any kind of skills you want to put towards the tenant movement. We are actively recruiting people to work on communications, to work on policy, just to do phone banking, to do all kinds of stuff. So please, if you're interested, get in touch. Don't be a stranger. And we're happy to take questions after, but I'm gonna pass it off to Farah and Eliana now to talk about why we included Reclaim Rent Control in our platform and why we believe that strengthening rent control is an essential part of any kind of city living.
Great. Let me just, So while Farrah's pulling up the slide, I'll introduce myself. Hey everyone, my name is Eliana. I'm an organizer for DC Jobs with Justice, and I'm also an organizer for the Reclaim Rent Control campaign. And then I'll let Farrah introduce herself.
Hey everybody, my name is Farrah, also with the Reclaim Rent Control campaign. And are you able to see the slides okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right.
So thanks to all the organizing done by tenant unions, the tenant unions and other tenant organizers, we were able to gain legislative emergency laws that help us throughout the emergency, such as no evictions or late fees during the emergency or 30 days after. There's no rent increases during the moment or 30 days after the pandemic is over. Currently, companies are not allowed to cut off utilities such as water, electricity, internet, or cable during the emergency. And also, lastly but not least, the council has put in place mortgage reliefs and rent reliefs for for owners, and then they have to pass on that relief down to the tenants, such as reducing the rents.
So we know right now that tenants are winning. The DC Tenants Union is doing awesome work. But that currently what the council has been passing is short-term and is really limited, right? We know that the affordable housing crisis didn't start with COVID-19. It's a long-term crisis and we need long-term solutions. So that's what Reclaim Rent Control is really about is, once we're out of this crisis, how do we ensure that rents can stay affordable in the long term and that we can prevent displacement of long-term residents?
So rent control is a set of laws designed to keep housing affordable and protects tenants from excessive rent increases and displacements. So the way rent control works in DC right now is it limits to 1 rent increase per year for everyone under the program. It only allows rent to be increased the inflation rate plus the 2%. And for seniors or people with disabilities, their rent is only allowed to go up the CPI, which is the inflation rate of the year, if they're registered.
Rent control covers approximately 90,000 families in the district, so it's a huge program. And the buildings that are covered are older buildings, so they have to be built before 1976. Larger buildings, you see their picture of the Woodner. In fact, the buildings have to be 5 units and up. And the building can't be covered by a subsidy. So Section 8 buildings, public housing, LIHTC, and other buildings covered by an affordable housing program are not under rent control since there's other rules governing how the rents can be increased.
So why rent control? Affordable rent control provides stability for everyone in the community. It leads to a healthier life, better education, and an overall stronger community. Rent control prevents displacements for its long-term residents, ensuring that those residents who have lived there for generations can stay in the communities they help build. Rent control also preserve affordable housing across DC, increasing the supplies for affordable housing in the market.
However, we know rent control is not working as well as it should be. Since 2000, over 20,000 Black residents have been pushed out of the city. DC, according to some reports, has the highest rate of gentrification in the country. Furthermore, we've been losing a huge number of rent control units. So 38% of units have been removed from the rent control program since it started.
So why we need to reclaim rent control? So DC has become widely segregated. Rent control has become a racial justice issue. So nearly half of the Black population in DC lives to the east of the Anacostia River, and that population is growing. They're being priced out of the western and northern parts of DC. So with every rent increase, DC residents are forced to move further and further away from their communities, their families, hospitals, and their vital resources. The target of these, or the scapegoats of these rent increases are low-income residents, people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, immigrants, and our community suffers every time the rent skyrockets.
So our demands, we want to ensure that we're keeping rents affordable both for current residents and for future residents. The first demand is to limit rent increases and end vacancy increases.
Okay, so right here's a real life example of one of our tenants. Her name is Ella Burdox, and her daughter and PJ, they were forced out of a apartment in DC named the Van Bernen in Northwest because the management decided to raise the rent, the full amount allowed under rent control this year, which is the inflation rate plus the 2%. So this made their apartment, their one bedroom apartment, the rent to $1,200 for the year. Even though, you know, Ella was on a fixed income and her daughter Jessica had 2 jobs, they still weren't able to afford to pay $2,100 for a 1-bedroom apartment. So they were forced to move out, what makes matters even worse is that owners can charge are allowed to raise the rent 20% more after a tenant leaves. It's called vacancy increase. So the next person who moves into the same apartment that Ella was evicted out of will pay $2,520 for their apartment.
Yeah, so as that example really illustrates, you know, Ella had 2 jobs. She was getting raises, but she still couldn't keep up with the rent increases. Rents are rising faster than wages. So this graph is showing rent as a percent of income and showing that over time we pay more and more of our income towards the rent. So what we looked at was we assumed that this year there was a resident who found a, you know, $1,000 a month apartment. Their income's $40,000 a year. There's an extra zero there, but it's $40,000 a year. So they're paying 30% of their income towards rent. So that's great, right? They have more money left over for food, for stuff for their kids. But every year, even if this person is getting the normal income increases, they're going to be paying more and more of their income towards rent because of that extra 2%. So in 20 years, instead of paying 30%, they'll be paying 40% of their income towards rent. Under reclaimed rent control, that's the red line there. It shows that actually, if they're getting these raises every year, their rent increase is pretty in line with income increases. And in fact, they'll be paying a slightly lower percentage of their income towards rent. This is another way to say it. So eliminating that extra 2%, right now they can charge CPI inflation plus 2%. Eliminating that extra 2% makes a huge difference over time. This is showing rents, the higher ones of the current program. The red is under reclaim rent control platform and showing what a big difference it makes over time. If the rent starts at $1,000 in 20 years, it'll be almost double. Under reclaim rent control, the rent would be $1,325. So our platform is really looking at keeping rents affordable in the long run.
Okay, so right here is an example of how vacancy agreements work. So vacancy increase allow rents to skyrocket over time. So with this example, I want you guys to keep in mind that this is the same unit. So this is different people moving into the same unit, so that you guys are able to keep up with the concept. So Peter moved in into this apartment, and he'd been there for 10 years. When as he left, his rent was $1,200. So here comes Sarah. She moves in. Her rent is, because of the 20% allowed of the vacancy increase, her rent, the rent was raised to $1,440. She stays in this apartment for 3 years. After she moves out, the landlord raises the 10%, which is allowed under the vacancy agreement. Here comes Sarah. She moves in, and when she moves in, the rent is $1,700. She stays in that same apartment for 2 years. And then finally, here comes Peter to take over the apartment. So when he comes to take over the apartment, because of that extra 10% allowed of the vacancy agreement, the apartment is now $1,936. So over the course of 5 years, the rent in the same exact apartment went from $1,200 to $1,936, which is a huge increase and doesn't really align with how pay increase works. Okay, so Here's an example of how that the same rent, the same apartment will work under our platform, taking away that 2% and only allowing rent to be increased under the CPI. So just to make it short, the big difference between this example and the first example is it's the same period of time. So the same 5-year time frame, but however, the rent began at $1,200 and it ended at $1,318 under our platform. So it aligns more with our pay rate, our pay increases over the years, which is amazing.
So our next demand is to expand rent control to protect more tenants. What we want to do is include all buildings more than 15 years old. So that means that every year new buildings would come into the program as they reach that 15-year threshold. So we would immediately be adding rent control protection for 17,000 families, and every year there would be some more. We also want to include all those 4-unit buildings around town, and that would immediately add 8,000 units to the rent control program.
Okay, so our demands, we want to protect tenants from extraordinary rent increases. So our goal is to reform our housing provider petitions. So sometimes landlords use petitions to raise the rent well above the normal limits. So our platform proposed to reform those petitions to better balance the needs of the landlords and the tenants. We want to make sure that these increases through petitions are temporary and not permanent. And we also want to require that landlords meet the capital reserve, have capital reserve and comply with the housing code before they are able to raise rents via petitions.
Yeah, and this is just a quick slide on hardship petitions, which is the most common petition. Currently, hardship petition says that if an owner is not making a 12% return on the building's equity, they can file a hardship petition to raise the rents. And we actually have a whole training on hardship petitions. It's available on our website. So if you really want to nerd out on hardship petitions, you can check that out. We'll also be offering it again. But some of the important things to know are that the average rent increase under a hardship petition is $642 a month. That means that folks' rent is going from one day to the next, increased by 70%. Since 2006, nearly 1,000 apartments have had their rent increase through a hardship petition. And what actually happens in reality is folks can't pay that increase, right? So they move, a lot of times they move when the hardship petition is filed, they move because of that threat, or they're displaced when it's granted. So our platform would reform hardship petitions by limiting the guaranteed profit rate. It would no longer be based on equity, but based on profit, narrowing the scope of hardship petitions, and most importantly, limiting rent increases to 5% a year instead of 70%, right? And making these increases temporary. So this would really be preserving affordable housing and preventing displacement.
Okay, a second way that landlords commonly use, the second method landlords commonly use to raise rents above the normal prices are voluntary agreements. So typically, owners make voluntary agreements with residents to keep rents affordable for the current residents, but it will raise the rent for future residents. On average, the increase is usually about $800. Long-term tenants are often bought out or pushed out because of this. So, for example, let's say that the front door, the front door is broken to the building. The landlord was come to the tenants and be like, okay, we'll repair the front door if you sign this voluntary petition, even though fixing the front door is part of keeping up with the building compliance. So what they'll do is they'll get the tenants to sign the agreements, which will raise the rents for future tenants and keep the rents good for them. However, the landlord wants, they want the rents to be high, all their apartments to be high market rent prices. So what they do is sometimes they either buy out the tenants or they don't fix the condition. They leave the bad living conditions so tenants will want to move out. So therefore they can raise the prices once new tenants come in.
Mm-hmm.
So our platform, we want to eliminate the voluntary agreement altogether just to preserve affordable housing and to prevent displacement.
And then our last demand is just that for every apartment in DC, there's just one rent increase a year. So this one demand is talking about apartments that aren't covered by rent control as well. You know, rent control is all about predictable and stable rent increases. And we really think that all DC renters deserve the protection of knowing when their rent will be increased and not worrying that, you know, from 1 month to the next, it could be increased. And then, you know, our platform was really designed by tenants. It came out of real life experiences of where folks were seeing just rent increases that were too high and rent control really being eroded. So it's endorsed by about 50 organizations, tenant associations, labor unions, legal advocates, religious groups, and community organizations. And we have a bill. So everything that you saw in the presentation until now is in an omnibus bill. It's in a big bill that the council could support. But what you're gonna find is, so these 5 folks are the 5 council members that are on the housing committee. And most likely, if you were to call any one of them today and said, you know, we need to reclaim rent control, they would be like, oh, don't worry, I totally support reauthorizing rent control. And what we're saying is that is not good enough. This system is broken. If you believe that we have an affordable housing crisis, then we need to do better. And so we need to pass this omnibus bill and really reclaim rent control. Brianne Nadeau, the council member for Ward 1, has said that she will introduce the omnibus bill. She said that at one of the DC Tenant Union rallies before COVID. But now she and some of her colleagues seem to be backtracking and saying, you know, they have too much going on with emergency legislation and the budget season. And so maybe they'll just reauthorize. So we really need to be holding their feet to the fire and saying, you know, affordable housing is not a short-term problem. Yes, we need to do things, emergency legislation, because there's an emergency, but we also need to deal with the affordable housing crisis by reclaiming rent control. In particular, the chair of the committee, Anita Bonds, has not moved on this, right? She would like to study it for the rest of her life, I think, and not actually do anything. So we really need to be pressuring these folks. So, you know, this is where you all come in.
So DC has an affordable housing crisis, but we have the answer. So we encourage you guys to sign our petition. And if you have already signed our petition, we encourage people to please share our petition to get others to sign as well. If you want to volunteer to host a training for your building, friends, coworkers, please reach out to us. And the way you could do so is through our poll. I added the poll and the petition to the chat so everyone has access to it. So we want to advocate and organize. Together we make a big impact. So all we have to do is put our voices and our ideas together, come together, and, you know, just stand strong, and we can make a big impact. And yeah, we also, if you can also, like, you know, create videos, short 1-minute videos, so we can share on our social, supporting our platform, or just sharing your experience with the high rent demand prices in DC. And below, I also put our Facebook, Twitter, and all our stuff, so you can follow us so you can stay updated.
So we're gonna stop sharing this just so we can see folks here. So thanks, folks. We'll update some of the, I think the info on from the emergency legislation is outdated, unfortunately. So we will update that. So we've got in the chat the petitions, the poll. Yes. So any questions around cancel rent or reclaim rent control? And let me just see.
I have a really simple question, if that's okay. Whose jurisdiction is the rent control program under? And if it's the city council, how do they even decide which units are included?
Yeah, well, so, you know, the units that are included are all buildings built before 76, 4 units and more that aren't subsidized. The only caveat to that would be if they were vacant in 1975. So that's part of the law. You know, that's in the city's code. And it's administered under the rent administrator, which is part of the Department of Housing and Community Development. And then that whole program is overseen by the housing committee. from the city council. So it's not so, you know, so I guess part of maybe what you're asking too is like they could decide to expand it. And the folks who can like decide to expand it are is the city council. And that would be changing the legislation to say that, you know, what we're saying is 4-unit buildings should be included, newer buildings should be included. With a really broad coalition, we came up with the plan that buildings 15 years and older should be included. And, you know, so laws are made by humans and they can be changed by us too, right? So we're really pushing the city council, first by pushing the housing committee. So those 5 folks who we showed in the last slide. And then also the rest of the council is going to need to vote for it as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and as you saw, you know, I think what we're kind of hearing is that they may use the current crisis as kind of an excuse to not deal with rent control right now. You know, it's up for reauthorization. It needs to be reauthorized by the end of this year. And for us, you know, we're saying like, why would you reauthorize something that's broken? To reauthorize it is sort of to co-sign it and say you think it's a good program. And while we think it's better than it not existing, it needs to be repaired. And this emergency, more than anything, really shows the need to have predictable, stable rent increases. You know, if people had had affordable rent for the long term, folks might have some savings, right? They might be okay if they didn't have work for a month, but that's not the case right now. The fact that so many people, we know 1/3 of renters nationally hadn't paid the rent by the 2nd week of April. You know, if folks can't do that, that's because the rent is too high. So that's both canceling rent in the short term, but also changing the way rents increase in the long term.
Yeah, and that's why I'll say for the DC Tenants Union, and I noticed that another co-board member, Malkeisha, just signed on. One of
I think Stephanie, you froze for a second. Are you there?
is showing that just, you know, it's really hard to pay the rent on a 1-bedroom apartment if you're working 3 jobs, 2 jobs overtime. Imagine what it's like if you don't have a job at all right now.
Yeah, so there was a question from Jennifer about DC had rent control in the past. So, you know, DC currently has rent control. We've had some form of rent control off and on, is it 1909? Since the beginning of, you know, the 1900s. We actually have a video on that, also on our videos page that's linked here. Amanda Huron, who's a historian who focuses on DC, did a webinar for us on the history of rent control. So this current law mostly was started in 1975. So we've had, and then was updated in 85. So we've had continuously this program since then. There's been some adjustments 10 years ago, but generally every time it's reauthorized, right? There's some changes. So DC does have rent control. We have one of the bigger rent control programs in the country. You know, it covers 90,000 units, but there are ways for landlords to get out of it, right? And there are these provider petitions, and then we know things like vacancy increases are just really eroding affordable housing. So yeah, so we've had it for a while, and it's probably why DC still has some affordable housing, right? But it definitely needs to be approved. Cool. Any other questions?
I'd like to make a comment. This is Gregory. A lot of people don't realize how the 2% causes such a problem. People think, oh, 2% rise, oh, that's not much. It's huge. It's compounded. For example, a few years ago, we had 0 increase in inflation. You add 2% to that, and that means the rent went up even though there was no inflation. It went up many times. If the inflation goes up 1% and rent, you add 2% to that, that means your rent has gone up 3 times the rate of inflation. Yep. Over a period of years, it's huge. In the last 10 years, our rent under rent control has gone up with the plus 2%, has gone up twice that of inflation over 10 years. And that's huge. Now, That means if we just simply eliminate the 2%, that means this huge increases over the last 15 years we're stuck with it.
Yep.
If we're going to reclaim rent control, we're going to need to reverse that 2%.
Mhm.
That means we slowly bring the rent down. It doesn't have to be overnight, doesn't have to be in 1 or 2 years, but we need to return rent to where it would have been if there had not been that plus 2%. So that's really reclaiming rent control by reversing the plus 2%, the huge increases. Another way of putting it, if you let the horses or the animals out of the barn and they've gone, and then you close the gate, that doesn't help very much. We've got to put those animals back in the barn. And that would be reclaiming rent control.
Yes, and I know you've been showing folks this spreadsheet I saw your spreadsheets like 15 years ago.
Oh
And
my goodness.
So I know you've been doing good work on this. Thank you. And now, I think we're really trying to get that out. Also, one of the DC Tenant Union's demands is no rent increases for 2 years. So even if there is some inflation, that could be a start at what you're talking about as far as rolling it back, right? And definitely, yeah, that's a key piece of this, right?
There are a lot of ways of reducing it so it would not be unfair to landlords. And I don't have any desire to be unfair to anybody, landlords included, but I also want it to be fair to tenants. And there are a lot of ways of reversing the 2%. I have never met a tenant who didn't believe that landlords shouldn't get a fair exchange for the benefits, for the shelter they provide, for the benefits they provide. But we're not worried about that. We just want fairness for renters.
Did you want to add anything, Stephanie, about the DC Tenant Union demands?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen what it's been like for landlords not to have rent increases for 2 months now, and the city didn't fall apart. We also haven't had evictions for about 2 months, and the city didn't fall apart. Landlords are still making plenty of money. They've been making money hands over fist for decades. So I think what you're saying is exactly right. Like we've got one of the most lucrative real estate markets in the country, and they've had an unfair advantage for decades. So it's time to make that advantage less unfair.
So I think we'll wrap it up unless folks have any final questions. But definitely thank you all for participating. It is budget season. The city council is looking at their budgets, right? One point that we really want to make is that rent control is a really affordable way for the city to preserve affordable housing, right? Like, unlike a lot of the other programs, it doesn't involve annual subsidies. It also makes things like tenant purchase way cheaper because you're keeping the price lower over the long run. So it allows tenants to purchase their buildings and own them cooperatively. It also allows for affordable housing developers to do it more affordably. So do call your council members, both your ward council member and the members of the committee, and ask them to reclaim rent control and support the DC Tenant Union. Cancel rent.
And if you want to stay in the loop on this, I just put the DC Tenants Union email sign up in there. I assume if you're on this call, you're on one of our lists. So hopefully you'll see our appeals for testimony when the time comes. But we are going to have a lot of opportunities to tell the council exactly what we need. And they've complained that we haven't shown up in force before. And I think we showed them in November just what force looks like. So let's pack the halls virtually, of course.
All right, thanks everybody. Good night.
And I want to say thank you to everyone who took the petition just now. Thank you. Signed it. We had like 5 people. Thank you.